Hello everybody, my name is Peter and I'm going to be your host for today, and I'm looking forward to moderating a really good session with our experts. Now we're going to just let a few seconds go on whilst people complete logging in. It always takes a couple of seconds, but whilst we do, then let me welcome you properly to this webinar with Gemserv. Now today, as I say, we've got a really good panel of experts, so let me introduce those. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Camilla, Camilla Winlo from Gemserv, to help set the scene and explain a little bit about who Gemserv are. And then I'm going to introduce our other two speakers to join us for our panel discussion. And that's Beverley Adams-Reynolds from Crisis and Philippa Harvey from the Cabinet Office. So a really good session lined up for today. Now, I just do want to make a couple of words about housekeeping. And they will be just a couple of words. First thing, this is a webinar, so don't worry about being on camera or being on mute. We can't see or hear you. However, we do want you to contribute questions. Now, you can do that if you look for the menu button, which is 3 dots, and you'll see that there's a chat tab for that. So if you click that, you can ask a question in chat or directly into the Q&A section. Now, I'll be looking at that all the way through our webinar today. So please, at any time, raise a question. We'll take as many of your questions as we possibly can, and I'll try and leave a little bit of time at the end to sweep all of those up. So questions at any time using chat or Q&A. I'd also like to just mention that this webinar is being recorded. So shortly after we complete, you will get instructions on how you can watch it again in the future. Now, what I'd like to do now is just talk a little bit about the format for today. In a moment, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand over to Camilla, as I say, to introduce herself and talk a little bit about what is user-centered privacy. Now, while she does that, I and Philippa and Bev will go off camera for a few seconds. Now, don't worry, this is not going to be death by PowerPoint. Camilla's only got a few slides, as I say, to set the scene. Then we're all going to come back on camera, drop the slides, and enter into our conversation where we're going to explore this topic in a little bit more detail. And as I said, I'd love for you to be submitting your questions. Now, if it's appropriate, we'll do it in that, but we may save some of them up towards the end. We're also going to have a poll about 2/3 of the way through the conversation. So look out for that. You'll find that again under the menu button. It's not live yet, but when it is, I'm going to ask you to select the answer that's closest to your experience. And we're going to leave the poll running for a little while to give people plenty of time to complete their results. And then we'll talk about it just before we get into the any other Q&A. So that's the format for today. As I say, what I'd like to do now is hand over to Camilla to take us through the conversation about what is user-centered privacy. And while she does, Bev and Philippa and I will just drop off camera for a moment.
Super. Good morning, everybody. I am the head of data privacy for Gemserv, and we believe in making the things that matter work better for everybody, and user-centered privacy is most definitely that. So before I get into what exactly it is and what this slide is saying to you, I just wanted to start by saying, why do we have regulations in the first place? Because really user-centered privacy is coming from the General Data Protection Regulation. And the reason why we have regulations is because something isn't working. Now, my background before I went into data protection was marketing, and I was a marketer for about 15 years. And the last 3 things that I did were launching new businesses in response to regulatory change. And because of doing that, one of the things that I've learned on my travels is that when a new regulation comes in, what it's telling you is that something isn't working. And if you are a private company, that means that you've got a potential competitive advantage if you can get the regulation working really well for your organisation. And if you're not a private organisation, it means there's something that you could be doing better for the users that you want to serve. So what we're going to talk about today is what user-centered privacy means in that context and why that is at the heart of the General Data Protection Regulation. So moving into this graphic, what we're looking at here is user-centered privacy. Right at the heart of it, you're talking about individual risk So risks are different from person to person. The kinds of things that can happen to somebody because of the way that their data is processed change depending on an individual based on who they are, what can happen to them, their environment. And so the things that they fear and the things they want to understand change as well. And part of that means that they'd like to be able to make choices. And the choices that people might want to make vary from individual to individual too. And in order to make those choices, they need control. And for that, you need to be able to give them choice and control. So how does that work? So on this slide, you can see we've divided it into two different categories. So we have information flows and operational delivery. But I could just as easily have called those things we know and things we do. So on the things we know information flows side, we have user insights and transparency. And what I mean by that is, by user insights, what do we know about the people whose data we're going to process? What do we understand about the risks that they face, their experiences, their fears, the things they want to choose and the things they want to control? And then on the transparency side, that's about making sure that they understand what's happening to them. So what information do we need to give them? What do we need to demonstrate about the way that we're processing their data to make them feel like they can make the right choices to control the risks that they face? That then has to translate into action, and that's where we get into operational delivery, the things that we do. And first of all, we need to design our processes. So we need to think about what processes people want us to design, and how we can build in choice and control and manage those risks for people, put the right safeguards in place on their personal data. But then we also, through the life of the product or the service, we also have complaints and requests. And they can also tell us things about the kinds of choices, risks, the kinds of control that people want to have over their personal data as well. That might mean that we might want to change the way that we design our processes. And all of that together is user-centered privacy. So I'm just going to move us on to our next slide. Now, this one's a bit different. So I've been all over the world training people, and I always talk about this belch and belch communication model, because what I found is that actually most people have never formally studied communication, and it can be really helpful to think about what's actually going on when we communicate with people. So this is about the things that we know side of our process. So here, first of all, a message has to have two things in order for it to actually become a message in a communication. You need to have a sender who has the message and is going to transmit it, and you need to have a receiver who wants or needs the message. So on the sender side of it, you need to be able to encode the message into something that then the receiver can receive. So I'm using English because we all speak English, and that's the expectation that we set, that this webinar would be in English. We then have a channel, that's this webinar software, and the receiver, that would be you at the moment, is able to decode it because you also were expecting it to be in English, and you have the link so you can use the same webinar platform. So the things that I'm saying to you are able to flow from me to you. Equally, there might be things that you want me to tell you, and that's where the option for you to put questions into the chat comes in. But for me to know whether things are actually coming across the way that they intend, I need to seek feedback, and that's this loop across the bottom. So I need to check that what I told you about was what you needed, and that you actually understood what I said in the way that you wanted. And also to check, is there anything else that you want to know now? And that can be interrupted by noise. So, you could have something loud going on in the background, or you might have this webinar on in the background and be doing your emails. All of that would be interrupting the message coming across. And the last point that I want to make, because it's super, super important, is that when you're putting your message together, you need to be aware that you have this field of experience that is all of the things that you know and all of the things you expect, the way you believe the world works, your underlying assumptions. And they intersect with the receiver's field of experience, but it's not the same. And it can be not the same in ways that are quite hard for you to predict. And that's why it's so important to seek those user insights, because without doing that, it may be impossible for you to really understand what it is that a user is looking for from their data protection. So what exactly are they expecting you to protect their data from? What do they need to know about it? What do they want to choose? What do they need to control? So this is my last slide before we get into the discussion. And with this one, I just wanted to make the point that it's not just a Gemserv thing, user-centered privacy. This really is embedded deep into the GDPR. This is what they want us to do properly. And we can see that really clearly in these excerpts that I've taken from the guidance that's on the Information Commissioner's website, talking about how they want us to think about the tasks that we need to complete for data protection. So when they talk about data protection impact assessments, the ICO tells us that we need to identify and assess risks to individuals. And at this point, it's worth me saying I really frequently see organisations that are using corporate risk models for data protection impact assessments. That's not what they're asking you to do. They're not asking you to look at the financial impact on your organisation. They're asking you to say, what could go wrong for the individual? With data subject rights, the ICO is telling us that we should be user testing to understand whether the privacy information we provide actually works with our users. We want to look at whether we're going to provide responses to a data subject access request in the individual's preferred format. If somebody asks us to rectify data, we need to ask them why and look at their arguments and evidence so we understand them better. When there's a personal data breach, the focus of the risk is the negative consequences for individuals, what can happen to them. And when we're protecting data by design and default, what we need to do depends on the individuals. So we need to give them sufficient choices and control and understand the risks. All of this is really deeply embedded into GDPR. The better that we do it, the better we'll be from a compliance point of view. But hopefully it's also clear that we're actually going to be serving our audiences better, which means that they're going to like the products and services and trust us more. And that's just good. So that's the end of all of my slides. If you have any more questions about all of that, please do pop them in the chat. We're really keen to hear from you. But now we'll move on to the main part of our discussion, and we'll bring in Beverley and Philippa.
Great. Thank you very much, Camilla. A great introduction to user-centered privacy. I think I'm going to come back to that towards the end when we do the summary. There's some really important parts there. But one of the most important things was obviously the balance of the interests of organisations and the individuals. So let's start our conversation then. And I'd like to just explore a couple of those aspects, if you wouldn't mind. So Beverley, I'm going to come to you first. And I'm going to ask, when we think about what does user-centered privacy mean to an organisation, what do you think are the differences between the various different groups of data subjects and how that might affect things like marketing and websites and so on?
Okay, so hi folks, I'm Bev Adams-Reynolds. I'm the DPO at Crisis UK, which is a national homelessness charity. We're based in England, Scotland and Wales. To try and set the context a little bit, last year Crisis decided that they wanted to increase our audience reach and decided to approach this through programmatic advertising. And I'm going to take it that everybody on the webinar understands what programmatic advertising is. But not everybody understands what programmatic advertising is, and not everybody understands what happens when they click accept cookies when they visit a website. So one of the things we did last year, and I worked with Camilla on this as well, we did do a DPIA on looking at the impact of programmatic advertising on the people who would visit our website. Now, our website looks at its audience can be categorized as people who want to support us, people who might want to donate to us or come on a journey with us to help end homelessness. But it's not just supporters who visit our website. We have our clients, our service users or potential service users who are looking to see what services we offer. And we also have people who are just curious, what is crisis all about? What do we do? How do we help people? So one of the very practical steps we took last year, once we'd done the DPIA, was actually look how we could try and mitigate some of the risks that came up in the DPIA on the various audiences. So if you think, when you visit a website, up pops the usual cookie banner, what do? You say accept all. But if people don't understand what that can actually mean, it can have a different impact on different audiences. So, for example, if people who are supporters of us or potential supporters, information about them visiting the website, if they've accepted the cookies, will go off to what is called an ad tech vendor. Now, that is basically an organisation who build up a picture of what the websites that people visit, and they're able to sell that data to organisations who want to get an advert about their organisation to them. So for our supporters, it might ping back that Bev's visited a crisis website, or it might ping back that Bev's visited another charity's website. And so the profile that the ad tech company build up about Bev is that she may be interested in supporting other charities. And where charities use this process of programmatic advertising to get ads in front of people, it won't just be an advert about crisis that Bev might see, it might be an advert about any other charity, because this process of what is called real-time bidding is literally in a microsecond, and it's where different organisations bid to get their advert in front of you. So from a supporter perspective, from Bev's perspective, it might be that I see adverts about other charities. But for our audience who are clients or potential clients looking at what our services that we offer are, well, they may also be looking at websites about what was their position during the pandemic, if they were thinking they might be evicted, for example, from their home, or if they'd got into debt because they weren't able to work. So the information that feeds back to an ad tech vendor about them picks up not just crisis, but all those other types of organisation. Now, unfortunately, that could have a negative impact on those sort of people. So they may be presented with ads from not so charitable organisations. So they may get things like free spins on gambling websites, or payday loan companies, or it could mean they don't see loans at such a preferential rate. So there can be a very different impact on the different audience. So what we did at Crisis, when we were deciding to move into this arena, we tried to mitigate the risk to those individuals who had potential to be clients, and didn't put the third-party tracking cookies on those web pages. You can't mitigate it to the point where it doesn't exist. So if someone visited our homepage and then navigated through and accept cookies, they would still receive them. But we did what we could to minimize the impact on people who are potential clients.
Great, thanks very much, Bev. Yeah, it's a very interesting topic, that, isn't it? I mean, when you look at the unintended or perhaps unknown way in which data can propagate everywhere.
It's the unknown.
Yeah, it is, yes. I mean, I think many people are actually rather shocked when they find out how much we all know about each other. Talking about what we know about each other, Philippa, I'm going to ask you in a second if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself. But in your role in the Cabinet Office, I know that you've had to think, obviously, quite a lot about the C word, COVID, and its impact on different people. But we don't live in a vacuum, do we? I mean, if there's one thing the pandemic showed us, is just how interconnected and interdependent we all are. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about, some of the concerns about COVID and how that affected different groups, perhaps even people from different countries.
Thank you, Peter. So I'm Philippa Harvey. I'm a civil servant that delivers some big programmes, most recently COP26, the climate conference in Glasgow. I'm hoping you all saw in the media. That brought together 128 world leaders, 38,000 delegates, and about twice those numbers in the fringe events around us. Trying to keep that was the largest indoor event since the start of the pandemic. And we held it without being in the media in terms of the logistics. We had media focus, people's headspace stayed completely on climate, which was what we needed to get the Glasgow Climate Pact we're all so proud of. So trying to keep that COVID safe, we achieved about a quarter of the COVID rate in the Scottish population at the time. Meant an awful lot of data, because not only did people need to be safe, they had to feel safe. And with an audience and a user group that diverse, trying to see and understand what people understood as to how would government use data. There are very different perspectives on that in very different countries. And working through that to build confidence that we could access the aggregate data we needed to understand the safety of the event, but also build confidence and build an appropriate degree of integration when we did have those positive cases as to how we responded, without going too far in the integration and the data issues that come in from that. So lots of different things to think about that most events in the past haven't had to. And in the future, I suspect we'll all be absolutely doing this.
Okay, thanks very much, Philippa. Yes, I do remember quite clearly COP26. It's staying on the agenda, I think, of very many organisations right now. If anything, it's actually increasing in importance. But it is that way about some of these larger things do require a community to actually take part. And that means that we're going to have to share an appropriate level of data in order to do that. So Camilla, let me just come back to you for a moment, because this concept of user-centered privacy, and I think I'd be really interested to hear about some of the things you're hearing from the organisations you talk to. So, what are some of the key themes that you hear? Are there concerns, or is it even seen as an opportunity?
It certainly should be seen as an opportunity. I think it's a huge opportunity, because all we're really asking people to do is get closer to their users, understand them better, and design things around them in a way that meets their needs. And as I said at the beginning, that to me strikes me as a very good way to run a better business and to serve your user groups better. One of the things that I see most often is, as a challenge, it's organisations who try to predict risks solely from internal sources. I think we're going to talk more about that a bit later. And also about how difficult that is, because you end up with a kind of groupthink. Even if you think your organisation is quite diverse, it's still unlikely to be as diverse as your user groups. And the other thing that I see is actually the moments at which people suddenly need to assess an individual risk for a specific person rather than a whole group of people. There's not always a process in place to do that and to think about it. Excuse me. So, for example, some of the data breaches that we see very, very frequently are things like what I would call fat fingers errors. So I sent something to the wrong person. And most of the time that's fine, but it may not be, depending on who the person was and the specific circumstances of the people that are concerned. So going right back to my very, very early career, I used to work for Halifax Bank of Scotland, and I remember being taught right at the beginning about the reasons why people needed to have choice and control over where bank statements and savings account statements were being sent. And the story that we were told then was about somebody who'd asked for their statements to be sent to their local branch for them to collect. And mistakenly, one of the statements was sent to a home instead, which caused this person's abusive partner to find out about their running away fund. That's not a risk that most people would recognise if they haven't been in that situation. You wouldn't necessarily understand why it is that we'd offered that choice and control. So there's a training issue there as well for people to understand why we do that and why there's a risk control there. And there's also this need, actually, that when you realise that you've done something like that, that you actually need to find a way of understanding what it did in the specific circumstances. So who is at risk? What are they at risk of? Not just, it would be very, very easy to look at that and go, well, never mind, we sent it to their home instead. That's hardly a data breach. But actually, it was the worst thing that could possibly have happened in that situation. So actually having that process and that thought process in place to make sure that when something happens, that you're actually able to assess it properly and really understand what could happen, that's incredibly important. And that's something that I see as being something that generally gets picked up when something's happened as opposed to being planned for.
Yeah, thanks very much, Camilla. That's such an interesting point, isn't it? It's, the consequences of a breach are very personal and individual. And I think many organisations perhaps start with thinking about, well, what is it that we face if things go wrong? But in a world where we are seeing much more digital transformation and adoption of digital channels than before, and where users are getting asked to share more data in order to allow organisations to offer them a much more controlled experience in things like customization and personalization. I think many leaders see opportunity there, saying, well, we've got all this digital data coming down and it allows us to get really great insights into it. But sometimes the value of that data is explored without a real understanding of the potential for harm or risk. So Camilla, I'm going to come back to you about this. So, the user-centered approach, I think that actually mirrors a lot about what many people are saying, is we need to use this technology to focus on individuals. But how do we get our leadership teams interested and engaged when we're talking about data protection and privacy?
Yeah, so actually, again, bringing in the user-centered approach can be a really good way to do that, because it makes it personal and human, and it allows you to tell stories about people where quite often, especially when you talk to the board, quite often you talk to them in quite abstract ways. And actually getting them to understand what it means on a user, personal basis can really change people's minds about what it is that they're suggesting that you do. It really helps to humanise things when you're having those discussions, particularly when you're suggesting doing something risky. So it can be very easy, because organisations, they are set up to think about how to achieve the organisation's goals. So that's the primary thing that your leadership team has in mind. Is this thing that we're proposing to do going to help us achieve our organisation's goals or not? And they will be seeing it in quite a specific way of, do the numbers look right, largely. But where the trust and the user impact comes in, that is a really different way of thinking about what you're actually proposing to do. And it can be seen as obstructive, and telling those stories can really help you get across to the leadership that this isn't obstructive, that actually what you're talking about is things that are potential risks to the commercial effectiveness of what you're suggesting, so that people don't trust it if they won't use it. Those are very common reasons why products and services don't work as well as intended. If that's the case, then you're not going to get those outcomes that you were looking for. And equally, some of the things that you could suggest doing, if people are nervous about them, that can have a reputational impact on you that changes the way they see your whole organisation in ways that you maybe weren't thinking about. And leadership should really care about that. But the best way to get that across, in my opinion, is to just make it really human, really real, and explain what it means in terms of people.
Yeah, and that's such a good point, Camilla. I think make it human. I know that user stories are like, well, imagine this happened to your partner or your child or your parent, what that impact would be, what it might be for a vulnerable person. Philippa, let me ask you a similar question then. When you're talking to leadership and in the Cabinet Office, I guess you're going about as high as it's possible to go. But when you're looking at this, the user-centered approach and exploring the balance between data protection and privacy and achieving goals, how did that affect the way that you thought and acted?
So absolutely, and the points that have just been made about making it human really resonate. That, for me, there were some very different user groups, and understanding those groups and being able to articulate the different concerns. If people didn't come to COP, we were never going to achieve climate outcomes. That's a statement of the obvious, but how do you communicate? How do you tell if people are going to feel safe? That's quite hard to explain. But when I start going granular and say about half of our visa applications went in the last 3 weeks, that tells you about people not feeling confident, sitting on the fence, not sure whether they're brave enough to travel. Trying to explain that to the senior leadership team, trying to make that alive with a group this large, it's quite hard. It's easy to focus on the Joe Bidens on those individual world leaders that have very specific concerns and are completely different to the concerns of an indigenous person from the rainforests of Brazil. It's just different. So it was finding stories, it was finding communication mechanisms, and I ran lots of Q&As, a bit like this, webinars with people from all over the world, to hear and understand what they were worried about. One of the big worries we hadn't expected was the question of self-isolation. If I get stuck in the UK for 10 days, will I be able to afford my hotel accommodation? Quite a granular piece, but that was the big concern as to whether some people could come. It was only by hearing that I could do something about it and work with the UN to try and address that piece and to really push some of the communication to help people understand what coming meant, understand how their data was using. That I asked about vaccination data, about people's vaccine status. That's pretty personal. But if you don't understand aggregate vaccination status, you can't understand the COVID security of an event, and you can't communicate that back. Depending on where you live in the world, whether you're prepared to share that data with government is really, really different. It's been used, we've all seen some of the media reports. Getting it shared with the UN, not with me directly, helped me address that. I only wanted aggregate, and really pushing and explaining that's what I was doing. Repeating and using that, combining that with a vaccine offer, which gave me the legitimacy to push vaccines really matter. They matter so much, I'm offering them to you. Helps square the circle, and it's seeing those indirect connections that makes it legitimate to ask for data and explain what you're using the data for and why.
That's a great example about vaccine status. I know one that's very emotive to a lot of people on both sides of the camp. And it reminds me of a discussion about marketing. All marketing is intrusion. And so it's actually trying to get the balance right between, we want to make people aware of facts or circumstances, but in order to do so, we need to know some stuff as well. And then I think this is going to lead into an interesting conversation about trust. Who do you trust with your data? Do you trust organizations? But thinking about trust, let me just change the word slightly to trustees. So Bev, you have trustees at Crisis, and how did you explain to them about programmatic DPIA and the way that the marketing works and the risks associated with it? Because obviously you've got, if anything, perhaps some of the most altruistic objectives of an organization, but again, it has to be balanced with how much data do we use and what associations can we make that our donors, our community would be prepared to accept. So I'd love to hear about your experiences doing that.
Yeah, sure. So Camilla mentioned about reputation, and I don't know how many people in the audience are aware, but in 2020, there was a reasonably damning report came out by Pro-Privacy on the title was something like the hidden data ecosystem in charities. And it was quite damning of charities getting into programmatic advertising. So one of our trustees in particular was really aware of this report. When it originally came out, I thought, okay, so, it's in a small niche market. And then the Financial Times picked up on it and ran a complete article on it. So certainly our trustees were aware of the potential impact and in terms of reputational damage as well. So this gave me a little bit of leverage to actually talk to both our senior management team and trustees about the potential impact of the route we were going down. But I think the mitigations I talked about earlier, actually making it back to about a person, because data is not, people are not commodities. Their data is not a commodity. It's all about people at the end of the day. So actually getting those small changes that we could even just put on the website and the build and construction of the page was a way of expressing to our SMT about the knock-on effect. Is that person going to get ads-free speech if we don't some sort of steps? So it gave me quite good leverage to open the door and have these discussions and keep it focused on the individuals rather than on the data and what the data could do for us.
Mm-hmm.
And Bev, I think that's a really interesting point. Is at the end of the day, data only provides insight into a real person. And it's never going to be a complete insight. And just like marketing, some people consider that an intrusion, perhaps an unwelcome one. Others see it as a way of getting, the focus that they would like to see from organizations. Tell me about what I'm interested in. Don't try to turn the fire hose on and tell me about everything. So they're trying to, I think, strike some kind of partnership, aren't they? So we have the users who have a stake and an interest, and we have the organizations that serve those users also. So I think this is a point where I'm going to ask our first poll question. And whilst we run this poll, we'll carry on the conversation, but we'll come back to it in a few minutes. So if everybody would like to go to the menu and find where it says poll, then find the answer to the question, how do you ask for user feedback on your data protection activities? Now, I do appreciate different users have different levels of interest. Some have a really high level of interest and read every line when it comes to their acceptance of things like cookies and so on. Others, I think, are much more focused on, well, I don't care. I'm just going to hit that accept all. So whatever one technique that you use, if any, please go to that poll. It's live now and give us your thoughts on that. But whilst you do it, let me come up to the next question that I have. And it's really this. This obviously sounds like it's a great initiative and a way that we can bring humanity back into the equation, make sure that we're respecting people's privacy and their rights. After all, data privacy came out of a human rights discussion. But what I'd like to know is, well, it's a laudable goal. But what are the kinds of challenges that we may face in taking a user-centric approach to privacy? So it sounds great in theory. How do we do it in practice? And Bev, let me come back to you. So, if you wouldn't mind, share some of your thoughts about, things like, do you get access to the people who use your services and other things that are going on? How did you face some of the challenges that obviously would come about once you embark down this course?
It's a mixed bag of a response, actually. In terms of working with people who are our clients, prices actually take what we call a co-production approach. And this is reasonably novel. I suppose we've been doing this for a couple of years now, where we do actually work with our clients on a number of different topics to get them engaged. And this is now one of the sort of drivers within Crisis. We do work with our supporters, but I have to say that in terms of privacy, it is a much more difficult package to sell, I think, in terms of saying, can I have a focus group or a user group with our supporters to actually talk to them about what we'd like to do? It has been much harder in that respect.
Yes, and I think particularly as we're all going through the COVID crisis, getting people together virtually, in person, all those different techniques. But it is important, isn't it, that we do get these insights into what, firstly, groups might expect and then individuals. Now, Philippa, you were talking about COP26, and as I know from your role, you've actually been engaged in a number of major programs. But one of the things I think that was typified by having to work in an environment which was volatile and there was a great deal of uncertainty and still trying to work out exactly what's going on. I'd love to hear your thoughts about how do you do that at the kind of pace you needed to do it, and how did you balance the practical versus the political requirements?
So absolutely, COVID has taught us about pace and volatility. We ran COP26 the first 2 weeks of November. 5 days later, Omicron hit the UK, which really tested or made me really think about were our structures strong enough, and we concluded they would have been if it had hit a couple of weeks earlier. But it's really interesting and really important to think through, have you built in the response to change? That, to me, it's about thinking about all your different user groups. It's about thinking about some scenarios and asking yourself whether you've got the flexibility built in. And it's really about your front end, that the staff who are engaging directly, who will see something change. Can you see the feedback loops? Can you use that feedback loop? And have you got strength and resilience behind you that if we have to change, can we do it? And have we got particularly senior leadership really bought into the concept of we may need to shift. We may need to shift rapidly and radically. That's a very hard conversation to have with a senior leadership team. But to have that prep behind you and to know that you could if you needed to. And for me, the big question was always, if we had Omicron 3 weeks earlier, that would have given me a very, very different environment as to whether or not we could adjust to that. I think we could have done, but I'm glad I didn't have to test it.
Thank you. So, yeah, it's a good point. Now, you just touched on something, I think, that when I talk to business leaders in a whole range of different environments, there's a few things that are common themes. The first of which was over the last 2 years, the word pivot certainly became in everybody's vocabulary. But now that we're starting to look forward again, then two terms that keep coming up are agility, so our ability to change course when we have to deal with things like the volatility and the uncertainty, and the word you used, resilience. Are we going to be able to deal with these additional challenges? So I definitely feel that people are looking forward now more so than they have been for a while, looking at opportunity as well as some of the challenges. But Camilla, let me ask you, if you wouldn't mind, before we open the floor up for more questions, could you round off really our conversation about some of the common challenges that your clients talk about and that you're helping them to think about and address?
Sure. So I think just in general, a really common challenge that a lot of organisations face is in seeing data protection and privacy as being an extra thing to do, as opposed to part of how we do things here. And if you see it that way, then you tend to be trying to do those things sort of on the side of the desk rather than incorporating them into what you're doing. And that just makes it harder, and it means that you don't get the benefits. You end up with this sort of pointless box ticking, frankly. Whereas if you incorporate it into the way that you go about things, then it gives you an opportunity to really get the most out of it. So as an example of that, sometimes when we start working with organisations, we'll find that we're working with an organisation that maybe does data protection impact assessments as the last thing they do before launch. That seems remarkably common. And lawyers will say the same thing. You get the contract way after everything's actually been negotiated, and it's all a bit late to do anything about the bits that aren't right. If instead you see your data protection impact assessment as being a really intrinsic part of how you design your project, and something that you're going to work through and keep coming back to, what you're actually going to be doing is sharpening your thinking all the way through the process of how you actually put your activity together. And it will bring in individuals right from the beginning. And one of the things that I think organisations, I'm not sure whether they don't realise it or they try not to think about it, but people simply won't engage with processes that they don't trust. So a challenge that I've seen in some organisations is, for example, you might decide that you're going to put a form up so that somebody has to register their contact details so they can download a white paper or something of that sort. And there can be a huge frustration that you'll then get Mickey Mouse at madeupemail.com, right? And a phone number of 01234 56789 because somebody doesn't want to get in touch with you, but they do want the white paper. Organisations can see that as a frustration, whereas it's going back to right at the beginning, where I was going, well, what are the user requests? What are the complaints you're getting? Well, they didn't want to do that, and they lied. And so you got bad data, which is the same as no data, but it's actually harder to pick out, right? Because it's only obvious when they've been made to be obvious. But if I just invent something that's not real and make it look real, you cannot tell, and I've just ruined your accuracy and the quality of your data in your database. As soon as I start doing that, or users in any volume start doing that, then you as an organisation can't trust the data set that you've got anymore because you're not sure what's accurate and what isn't. And that starts to mean that you can't use that for data-driven innovation. You can't use it to achieve your corporate goals. So that is, that altogether is really, in a nutshell, the challenge that I see that organisations that don't take the user-centred approach, that don't build it in from the beginning, that don't see it as being part of how we do things here, they end up with these unintended consequences that cannot be avoided after the fact. But that if you'd incorporated that thinking right from the beginning, you would have done it in a way that meant that those things didn't happen to you, and you understood how to get the balance right. And so you could achieve your corporate goals probably better than if you just tried to foist things onto people that they didn't want, because people can and will control their data, just not necessarily in the ways that you want them to.
Yeah, I think you used a word there, I think, is actually at the crux of this discussion, which is trust. Mm-hmm. So that people share their data with organizations and individuals that they trust. But what does trust mean? Well, for most people, it actually means an organization being very clear about what it's going to do and why, and then living up to that promise by doing that consistently over and over and over again. And some organizations, and we're well aware of some of the brands, making a big thing at the moment about we protect your data, we don't let anybody else see it, and they're trying to claim that ground. They clearly see it as an opportunity to be different from the Wild West, where people think, well, if I give you my data, you're going to abuse it, you're going to share it with other people. I don't have control over my data. So I think there's a bit of a picture emerging here about be clear about what you're doing and why and who it serves, and make sure that you think about the user, the individual about this, but then also delivering on your promise. It's one thing to say, yes, we'll take care of your data, and then actually be a bit fast and loose about how it's used. And I think that's one of the other things that came up very clearly in the pandemic. With all this digital transformation going on, there are clearly some people who have really taken that to heart, and organizations have done it very well, and others who are getting a reputation of they're a bit fast about how they use that data. Now, one of the challenges that will mean, of course, is with the proposed demise of the third-party cookie, many more organizations are going to be much more reliant on first-party data, the data that they have, which has been supplied by their customers. But if that data is, as you said, polluted by people who are deliberately trying to mislead or trying to get some anonymity out of it, it's worse than no value, because actually it's putting a lot of value in it, risk into the equation. Anyway, I just want to remind people, please do ask questions in chat. But before we do that, I'm going to publish the poll results. So this is what we saw. So the question was this: how do you ask for user feedback on your data protection activities? There were 4 possible answers. Least popular, internal straw poll. Okay, that's a little bit about inside out. We ask ourselves what we think we need to do. Followed by focus groups. So, we do actually go out and ask communities about what they look like. Surveys, very popular technique, but perhaps one that is a little worrying is nearly half of the people on this webinar don't ask for user feedback. So, Camilla, let me come to you first. Does that line up with your experience? About half of the organizations you deal with don't actually ask users about their feedback on data protection.
Honestly, I think that's quite low. So if what we've got is a group of people where only half are not doing anything at all, and I think that suggests that we've actually got a group of people on this webinar who are already taking user-centred privacy quite seriously, and that's great. I think it's very uncommon, actually, to talk to users directly about data protection activities. From what I see, organisations that do run things like focus groups and survey their customers, that tends to be very strongly focused on the customer service experience rather than anything more operational or more directional than that. It's very uncommon to include users into strategy or into discussions about how the organisation communicates with them. So if more than half of people on this webinar are doing something, then I think that's actually better than most. But equally, we have half who are not talking to their users and therefore don't understand, as we've discussed the whole way through, don't necessarily understand as well as they would like to do, as well as would be useful for them, more importantly, what it is that users see as being risks, what choice, what control they have or even what they're doing to make sure that they feel like they're exercising that choice and control, even if it's not made explicitly available to them to do that. So yeah, it's kind of in line with my expectations, but I'll be honest, I think you're pretty good.
Yeah, I think let me very quickly put that question to Bev as well. So Bev, is that what you would have expected to see? Roughly half of the people on the call saying we don't do anything at all to gather user feedback about data protection?
I echo Camilla's thoughts there. Our charity talks to our supporters a lot. It talks to our clients a lot, but yeah, it's rare that privacy and data protection are the issues that get discussed. I think quite often, depending on the organizational structure of a company, data protection is a compliance issue, and it's not necessarily about the user focus in terms of engagement with them on that topic.
Yeah, thanks, Bev. Philippa, same thing. I think I'm hearing here that perhaps some of these organisations think of data protection and privacy as being a necessary evil that they have to do, perhaps rather than getting an understanding, well, what is it that our users want? After all, if your users don't trust you, that can put you in a very interesting position as an organisation.
I'd completely agree. I think it's quite easy to talk about data protection as a compliance thing you bolt on afterwards. But when you make it far more human, and will people come? Do people have confidence? How do we make the event? How do we make the service work? How do we get people to engage? When you ask questions like that, you're actually asking about data protection. But by going at it at the user-centric face, it's sometimes easier to engage. But I also think we need to be kind to ourselves in some of this. It's really, really hard to get at users. And the variety and variation of user groups are huge. I was worried about the population of Glasgow as a whole. Would people feel comfortable with what I was bringing to their city? That's a user group that isn't directly using us. Finding ways to get hold of them and understand their perspectives are really, really hard. So there is a bit of being kind to yourself, and not that engaging, learning, listening, and it's all about listening, and perhaps not using what can come across as a security, a legalistic phrase, data protection, and instead ask people, what are they worried about? Why did you bother coming to my Q&A about this event, this thing? You're probably concerned. And if one person is asking you a question, I reckon there's at least 10 out there that are thinking it. And it's hard to try and extrapolate that one question. But the one person that asked me if their PCR tests, swabs, could be used for cloning, and would we do that? Yeah, you all grinned. That wasn't something that had ever occurred to me, but it clearly was a concern for somebody. Okay, now I need to think about how we communicate why we're not going to do that. Of course we wouldn't. But that somebody needed that reassurance tells you a lot.
It does. And I think that this is also one of the things we've seen an enormous decline in trust since the 70s. Well, trust in established institutions and authority. People look to other sources of information for that. I'm going to come back to trust, and Bev. Now, obviously, I'd love to know a little bit more. I mean, trust must be intrinsic to your values as Crisis. So how does that work with you about the promises that you are making, the core of or foundation of trust, and your values?
There's two aspects to one. One is an external aspect. We're a charity. We're not the biggest charity in the UK, but we're definitely not the smallest. So as a charity, there is external expectations on us from the Charity Commission. But I think Crisis as an organisation is very, very proud to have a set of values, and we try and meld those values into every aspect of what we do. One of those values in particular is about treating people with dignity and respect, and that also morphs into how you treat people's information. It's not just about treating people, but treating their information, because that is the person. So treating that information with dignity and respect at the same time.
Yeah, thank you. And I think so many people, that's important, is it? It's at the core of, I guess, an empathetic relationship with an organisation, mutual dignity and respect and understanding of each point. Philippa, I'm just going to come to you for a couple of moments because I'm going to come back to this trust thing. Yeah, how do we manifest trust when we look at things like integration? So, it's a laudable aim. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't question it, but how do we actually do it practically when we're thinking about things like integration?
I think so. Trust and integration is quite a tough one. That the more you integrate a service, the more you're sharing data. That from a user's perspective, as a really simple example, a positive COVID test, there is action that's needed. Having got that positive COVID test, why should that person then have to tell me that I've had a positive? Why wouldn't I just know? Why wouldn't I just know their individual vaccine status so I can give targeted advice? Why wouldn't I be able to connect them straight into the welfare fund because I know they needed help? Well, choosing to integrate means I choose to share data. And explaining that giving them control and not integrating, it's their choice then how they engage. It also, by not integrating, gives you more resilience and greater ability to flex. You can design 5 different individual responses, individual processes separately. Is a lot easier than designing it as an integrated picture. And if you're running at Max 6, that can be an important thing. So creeping those connections, but really understanding and having that conversation about why it's not integrated. Because if you're the person at the sharp end that you've just had that positive result, that's the moment where you're feeling scared and you perhaps wanted integration and it wasn't there. So you've got to keep the conversation up about what and why. Mm-hmm. It's tough. It's really tough.
Yeah, thank you, Philippa. And I'm going to come to Camilla just for a final word, very briefly. And it's about this, Camilla, that in the Far East, we've seen the rise of so-called mega platforms. That's where consumers, when they want to do something like book a holiday, they can go onto a platform where multiple vendors are sharing data and facilities to cater for every aspect of what that consumer is trying to achieve. So flights, hotels, experiences and excursions and so on. But clearly that means a great deal of data sharing, and maybe there's a regulatory framework where that might be a little easier than elsewhere. But let me just ask you this briefly. In putting this into practice, do you have a couple of top tips that you would share with people from your experience about where Gemserv can help?
Sure. So I think from our point of view, data-driven innovation is incredibly important. It's why we've got GDPR in the first place. Because the UK national data strategy now, the EU approach to data-driven innovation is that these things are potentially enormously socially beneficial. As Philippa said, if you can integrate data and you can do that in a really good way, and it requires a lot of planning and time and effort to do it properly, so it's not to be underestimated. If you can do that, that has potential benefits to people, and it can also be a matter of meeting their expectations. But it's not enough to try and do that sort of thing and without being able to support it with the time, the resource, the effort. Because if you do that, then the potential consequences are significant, and it can cause people to lose trust in an enormous amount of things. So I think if I was going to give people a top tip, it would be, as I said before, bring your data protection impact assessment in right at the beginning, right when you start conceiving of what it is that you're thinking of building. Start then thinking about how are my users going to react to this? How can I talk to them about how they're going to react to this? What kind of risks might they face from this? What sort of choice and control do I need to offer as part of this? Having figured out, which is quite an important one, how much choice and control people want, should I even be trying this integrated approach? Because it might be more effort than people would be prepared to use it. And I think that's where Philippa came from a little bit as well. And actually, right from the beginning, think about how do I design this in and how do I make this work for my users and for us, and understand whether it is likely to work in practice or whether people are going to find workarounds so that it doesn't. So Start from the beginning. That's my first thing. Don't think of data protection as something that you do at the end of your data protection team as being people who understand one very small aspect of it and can be tacked on right at the end to make it compliant. It isn't what we're for. We are right up there with the marketing team, with your with your operational team, as being the voice of your consumer and helping you design something that's actually going to work and deliver as you expect it to. But we can only do that if you bring us in as early as possible, and treat us as being a partner who is going to help you make your project succeed.
Great, thank you very much, Camilla. So then, in the sense of transparency that we've been talking about, what's going to happen next? Well, we'll reach out to those people on the webinar and give you an opportunity to continue this conversation one-to-one. But with that, all that really remains for me to do is to firstly thank our experts. So thank you, Camilla, Bev and Philippa, for your insights. Thanks to Gemserv for making this webinar possible and the ELN for organisation. But most of all, thank you for your attention. I hope you found this an informative webinar. And until the next time, thank you all and goodbye. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye.